welcome back. It's a great show. I love it. Let's begin the show by looking back at 2015, and then we're going to turn it around and look at 2016. And Mary Ellen, we'll start with you, but I would like each participant here to give their own viewpoints. What were a couple of the most important political news stories about Florida during 2015? Mary Ellen.
Well, since this is inside Florida politics, I think anybody who watches Florida politics would say that they're pretty surprised that Jeb Bush, who is, one of probably the most revered Republican politicians in Florida history, his campaign has imploded the way it has. I think that has been a big story. I think it's a surprise. And I think that it will have a ripple effect. Once again, Jeb hasn't been on the ballot in 12 years in Florida, but he still held this reverence within the Republican establishment here.
Is it a done deal?
Is it a done deal? I think that his campaign, I think the fact that his campaign is struggling is definitely a sign that it's almost done.
Steve.
Well, this was the year that, for better or worse, and I would say mostly for worse, Florida got a full-time legislature. It seemed like they were always in Tallahassee, 3-4 special sessions, constantly being reined in by the courts because of a botched redistricting process. And so you had an unprecedented level of involvement by the judiciary into what the legislature is doing. They almost didn't pass a budget on time. We're going to find out in 2016, which, by the way, it marks 20 years since the Republican Party took control of the complete legislature.
Wow.
You go back to 96 and Danny Webster. So we're now there at the 20-year mark. We're going to see if they've learned their lesson. But this was really an awful sight, a lot of dysfunction. You have a passive governor who really doesn't know how to sort of interject himself in there with the legislature. And so it was a difficult year, a lot of problems, and let's see if they can turn the corner.
John?
Well, I think going back to the beginning of 2015, we had Governor Rick Scott being re-inaugurated. He becomes only the second Republican governor in history to win re-election. He joins Jeb Bush with that honor. It's kind of surprising for a guy like Scott, who is not known for his connection with Floridians, his appeal to the Florida legislature. As Steve mentioned, he's a little bit of a passive governor. Yet at the same time, Scott is positioned right now to have an 8-year imprint on Florida politics and the economy. Not many people can make that claim.
And Jim?
Well, just piggybacking on what Steve was talking about, the redistricting issue has been dominant for months. It may not be dominant out in the hinterlands of Florida, but in Tallahassee and in the courts and in the legislature, it's been sort of an overriding issue, and it's been quite remarkable. The legislature had an opportunity to pass a congressional redistricting plan and a Senate redistricting plan and couldn't get the deals done. And essentially it did lead to this courts drawing maps. And I don't think that anybody really expected that. It could have ramifications in the 2016 elections. There's a lot of thought that Democrats at least have an opportunity to pick up some seats. But it has long-term implications as well, because there's going to be another redistricting process just 5-6 years away. And there's legal precedent being set, and this is going to have some, again, it could be a dry issue, but it could have some very long-lasting impacts.
John, I don't think anyone who really has observed the legislature over the years can recall a session, 2015 session, that was more cantankerous and rancorous than this one. And there was a lot at stake with redistricting. What was at the bottom of this strife? There were issues, for sure, but something happened to presiding officers who entered the session pretty personally close, and we thought politically close, but it all fell apart, and it's become very bitter. What did you observe? What happened?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think Senate President Andy Gardner and House Speaker Steve Crisafulli, yes, indeed, they are kind of close personally. Their districts are near each other. They're both two Central Florida guys of about the same age and to some degree same experience. But I think Gardner, the Senate president, surprised Crisafulli with his commitment to trying to expand Medicaid by introducing a privatized form of Medicaid expansion, which is an extension of the Affordable Care Act, which of course is President Obama's signature legislation. I think that was a surprise to the House, and that set things off on a very bad footing and led to a protracted fight that engulfed the state budget as well, and then with the backdrop of redistricting and a Senate presidency fight for the future leadership post, a lot of those things really clouded this session. But it comes down to, I think to some degree, I think the Senate is a very pragmatic body. They saw the Medicaid expansion idea as being something that could easily supplement what was going to be a loss of federal health care dollars in another sector. And the House won't go along with that. The House is very ideological, and they saw it as, we are not going to embrace anything that looks like it would be supportive of President Obama.
Steve, I think that one of the things about this legislative session that is an example that there's so many things feeding into what happened. As John was saying, there's the ideological versus pragmatic split between the House and the Senate, but to me there's also what's happening within the Republican caucus itself, and that is that the Senate had this really bitter Senate presidency fight that lasted probably a year longer than anybody thought it would last.
Almost to the end of 2015.
Yeah, it lasted the whole year, and then you had that whole dynamic that allowed the Medicaid fight to happen, which was this disagreement and lack of planning over losing federal LIP money. I think that is a reflection on the fact that if the governor's office had been a little more attuned to that, they could have used that issue and opened, I think, more dialogue about that earlier. I think that what we ended up with was this very polarized House and Senate. And when you have polarization, in the absence of strong leadership in the executive branch, that just leads to this meltdown. And I think it makes me wonder if we'd had a stronger governor who could have brought both factions of his party together, would things have looked differently?
Steve, these folks are going to have to continue to work together into 2016.
Right.
And it looks like there are some pretty heady issues beginning to surface for 2016 already. What are some of those issues?
Rick Scott wants to cut taxes by $1 billion. I'll say to all of your viewers, it's not going to happen. He's not going to get $1 billion. I doubt it severely that's going to happen. There is going to be these ancillary issues that come up every session, like healthcare fights and scope of practice, things like that. But it's an election year. Because it's an election year, they're going to tread lightly and walk on eggshells and try to get out on time because, again, back to Jim's point about redistricting, it looks like all 40 senators are going to have to run for election. And we're going to see something, by the way, that we haven't seen in a long time in Tallahassee, which is there's going to be significant turnover in the Florida Senate in 2016. There are 8 or 9 seats turning over, maybe more. People pursue ambitions and so forth.
Favoring Republicans or Democrats?
Well, the general thinking is that the redistricting is going to help the Democrats a little bit. And right now it's 26 Republican, 14 Democrat. And I think there's no scenario where the Democrats could get a majority, but because the Democrats, by the way, in recent cycles have not been very good at recruiting good candidates. But if they should pick up, let's say they pick up 3 seats, and now it's 23-17, you've just changed the dynamics in Tallahassee dramatically because the Democrats could pick up a few moderate Republicans on a whole host of issues and transform the direction of the debate.
Mary Ellen.
Well, I think that Steve's right about that. I think when you look at some of the issues, that the question will be, will this competitive Senate have a moderating influence on policy? There are going to be some seats where there will be competition in the primary, but the more interesting place will be those, because we're going to have a court-drawn Senate map, the possibility of the map being having many more marginalized seats or seats where they're close, either party could win, that is going to influence policy because people are going to have to start taking positions that are on the middle or that are designed to win in a close seat. And I think that'll have, as Steve said, I think it could be dramatic.
Jim, congressional redistricting could have a big impact on several key races, some up here in the Panhandle, some in Miami. Give us a look at some of those.
Well, I think there's a few that everybody's watching, one of which is the district that Gwen Graham represents up here in Tallahassee area over to Panama City. She's assuming this congressional map that the Supreme Court has approved stands up in federal court, because there's more challenges coming, but assuming that stands up, she's going to have a hard time retaining that seat because it's redrawn as even more conservative than it was, and it was a swing seat in the first place. Charlie Crist is back. He's got a district that's drawn pretty much for a Democrat in his hometown of St. Petersburg, so it looks like the Democrats will pick up that seat. Dan Webster, Steve alluded to him in a different context earlier, but you know, he's sort of a legendary figure in Republican politics in Florida, but his district has been redrawn in a way in which even he has conceded in court papers that probably is going to be difficult, if not impossible, for him to win in the Orlando area. And then down in Miami-Dade, there's an interesting issue down there too. Carlos Curbelo, who's a freshman Republican, may be in some trouble because of the way his district was drawn. You know, the ripples are all over the state. Just dovetailing on what Steve mentioned, you know, part of the big question in my mind going forward is, can the Democrats recruit good candidates, and can they back them financially and run good campaigns? Because other than Barack Obama's campaigns in Florida and Bill Nelson winning and a few other scattered campaigns, the Democrats have not been successful in a long time.
No, it's a golden opportunity because we've learned in recent cycles, it's a presidential election year. We're going to get a very high turnout. People are upset about a whole host of issues and very worried about their personal security and so forth, but we've seen turnouts approach the 80s in the last couple of presidential cycles.